Thank you very much. I was asked to step in here at the last moment in place of Carey Wolf. I told Fiona this morning I very nearly backed out because on the same day that I was asked to do this, Penguin Books offered me a contract with a 7-month deadline for delivery of manuscript, which is almost impossible. So I had to squeeze in writing a chapter and a half in that time as well. So this will not have the polish and timeliness probably of Siobhan's paper yesterday, which I noticed she just tipped her head round and thought, yeah, that's exactly on time. I won't be doing that because I should be looking frantic and Fiona will be looking frantically at me because what I did manage to do is fulfill the obligation of writing a complete paper, which is almost ready to go into one of the conference publications. So what I was unable to do was to find a way of doing it in just 45 minutes with my normal penchant for millions of side tracks and anecdotes. But anyway, and like all of you, I'm sure, I've never been one to allow a good conference theme to get in the way of what I really want to say. But this is the exception. I had a perfectly okay paper, which I could have expanded, sort of on the conference theme. But in the end, I got absorbed by the conference theme itself, by the idea of the Anthropocene. I think it's a totally bonkers idea in many ways, and you'll see why in a minute. But I also think it's really, really useful because in all of our disciplines, we really are not used to contextualizing what we have to say in the broader time frame that the Anthropocene gives us. And because we narrow the time frames of relevance for theory, scholarly exposition and politics, we make all kinds of assumptions about humanity on Earth, which I think the Anthropocene has the potential to correct. But I do notice, whereas in my discipline, we suffer with the narcissism of small differences, right? We hate each other like crazy over the smallest things and agree on most things. In that sense, we're comfortingly like any village anywhere in the world. We hate our neighbours. We fucking hate our neighbours. But we're mostly married to them and we're mostly identical to them, right? Science is the opposite. Scientists, they come up with these wild, crazy ideas and absolutely love them. And the Anthropocene is one of them. So this paper is going to be in 2 parts. I'm going to struggle to pack in what I want to say about the Anthropocene, and then I'm going to say something about a real life case where some of the points I'm developing with the Anthropocene can be seen in action. Animals and humans in action in Australia, and it's all going to be focused around Felis catus, the cat, the domestic cat, or is it the feral cat, or are they both? So that's really the structure. I've said already that the Anthropocene I find an incoherent concept, and it's incoherent, and science are bonkers because it started in the late 90s, the first inklings of it, the first discussions of it, and it's first published in the year 2000. I think that it was published when neoliberalism is firmly entrenched, and so entrenched it's starting to worry the bejeevers out of all of us. I think it's very significant that it gets coined then. But it gets coined, and it's first of all associated with that previous period, 30 years of extreme greediness and excessive growth, a kind of economic development growth that's not tied to moral projects of modernity, as the mid-20th century and the 19th century were. things tied to need, things tied to sort of abject human poverties, things that had a kind of moral basis, food, material. No, the Anthropocene comes into the politics of the post-material concerns about a species that's gone insane, wild and out of control. So it's the 30 years, but then another scientist pops up and said, well, no, that's bullshit, because, you know, it has to be since the long boom post-1945. I mean, that is clearly when so much of this terrible stuff happened. And then another person pops up and says, no, well, it can't be that. It would have to be the wider expansion of industrial development in the 19th century, twinned with the development of large territorializations that hadn't existed before, called nation states, each of which vied with one another, competed with one another for economic development and ascendancy, and developed colonies to supply the raw materials and the wealth and luxuries that they aspired to. And then someone piped up and said, well, that's nonsense, because surely humans trashed the world for agriculture, which then takes us back not to 1820, but to 3500 BC, to take the Neolithic revolution in my country, in Britain. It was earlier elsewhere, in China. So we go back to the Neolithic, and then another scientist pops up and said, well, that's bullshit, because, you know, major extinctions happened in the late Paleolithic and the early Holocene. And so it's an incoherent concept, because, in fact, what they're saying collectively, these mad, crazy scientists who know very little, actually, about the history of humanity on planet Earth, which never stops them pontificating about it, of course, is that they're describing our species being. Our species being is, we are a disturbing species. We are creators of history that is disturbance. And I think this is quite an interesting thing, because it helps us to reflect on what we can aspire to become. My big, I've got about 8 years left before I retire, and I am dedicating most of my work now to developing designs for low carbon societies. That's what I'm interested in. So this project really interests me, but I know that I cannot identify a kind of primordial nature which excludes human beings, and neither is it possible in our history to develop a period when we were more in harmony and more sustainable than these disturbing creatures I've been describing so far. Even the Paleolithic, some scientists claim, it's contentious, that the large megafauna of Australia were wiped out by hunters. Aboriginal societies, you know, burnt the continent and totally changed the vegetation. It was already heading towards a fire landscape, but they extended it and consolidated it. And in doing so, they did do quite a bit of damage. Some species did really well, others not so well. And this is the history of our species. When we're trying to design low carbon societies, we have to bear that in mind, and we can't go back to these dreamy, rose-tinted dreams of a life before industrialization, you know, to recover something of our past. We've got to go forwards and invent our own Anthropocene. So that's why I don't like what they predict will be the latest one, the Sustainocene. I think that's absolutely ghastly. I won't live it. I'll kill myself rather than live in the Sustainocene. I want the Anthropocene. I want a world with humans in it to grow up and learn how to live here reasonably well. Because we can do what many of these forefathers and mothers of ours couldn't do. We've grown, and one of the things that I like about the Anthropocene is how it teaches us that as we've gone through it, we haven't just been this wild, crazy, insane, disordered human. We've created objects which then around which new subjectivities have grown. It's not like we've been the same human being all the way through, and we have actually formed all forms of regret and passion and remorse and ways in which we want to revise the way we live with other animals. It's not like we haven't done that. We've been creating new subjectivities quite frequently, particularly when we became aware of the kind of extensive damage that we can create. And that was made possible, really, by the nation states and by the development of science. But I want to get on to... So some of these slides are just there for the... because this is being published online, and so I wanted to make sure that this is all covered nicely. There's some examples here that I'm not going to go into, Gavin Prideaux and some of the people making claims about the Aboriginal responsibility for the loss of the megafauna. Some people say it's climate change, but these people are convinced it's not. I want to start opening up what these objects are that created new subjectivities. And one of the objects I quite like is ecosystem. It's a great object for humanity. It's a great ordering concept. And it, oh look, there's a spelling, sorry, that's Alfred George Whitehead there. That's terrible. I'm his biggest fan, and I've misspelt it. And I tell you to read him as well. How ironic. Anyway, so it's Alfred George Whitehead. It wasn't until these nation states occurred, these large territorializations became interesting to humanity because they were part of new national estates. And it was Alexander von Humboldt who in travels between 1898 and 1904, shortly afterwards, captured for the first time an object that had never existed before. This was something called a natural environment. Hadn't happened before, new concept. And it gave rise to the idea that the natural world was like the human world in the sense that it composed of legitimate, self-sustaining communities of species, which got developed into a more elaborate version, which I'm calling ecosystem. And this, what this did, this object, is it gave rise to a kind of, it was almost an anthropomorphization of nature in the sense of creating communities of belonging. The idea that some species belong, and of course, as soon as we establish who belongs, we also identify who doesn't belong, who's alien to that. And what should have been a fluid, open, and evolving concept, ironically became deeply conservative, and in the hands of nation states and scientists and conservation managers became a metaphoric sliding from an abstraction, an ecosystem, to a constitution or contract, because this became the object which must be preserved. This became the zero line against which to judge a proper nature from an improper nature. And Alfred George Whitehead, and after him Donna Haraway, refer to this thing as the fallacy of misplaced concretism. The idea that an abstract heuristic concept like ecosystem can be taken for the way the world really is. And the world really isn't like that. And one of the reasons the world really isn't like that is because it's got human beings in it. And human beings are never entered in as species into ecosystems, because human beings never present themselves as species. They're always presented as cultures, right? Which are always already intertwined, co-evolved with those natures. They are there, but they were absented by this model, and that is really interesting because it's then taken as an externality for humans to use as a way of guiding policy, framing strategies for the Anthropocene. So there we are. We create subjectivities, and I'm going to tell you some of those subjectivities, who they are in a minute. So we've got to watch for these slippery heuristic concepts, sliding, metaphoric slidings from instruction to contract. We've got to beware also of tainted concepts of nature that exclude humanity. And this tainting is referencing this sliding in, this pulling back of older pre-scientific religious and historical notions of humans as existing outside of nature. And there we get into human exceptionalism and recover it for a modern period. And I still think the Anthropocene is a breathtaking example of human exceptionalism, personally. Okay, so I think I'm done there. I want to go to subjectivities for ecosystem. Yeah, so it creates subjects and criteria, people, agencies, rules, who administer belonging to territory and not belonging. It creates national organisations, conservation biology strategies, guidelines, management of national estates. It creates government, national enrolment and distribution of national natures, new natural territories, reintroductions, policy, but also culling policies. It creates criteria for national research priorities. I published something recently on this, and someone pointed out to me that the AASG actually has two national research priorities that are directly related to this ordering of ecosystem. And you know, this worries me hugely. You get something like managing and protecting Australia's terrestrial and marine biodiversity, both for its own value and to develop long-term use of ecosystemic goods and services ranging, you know, oh dear, this is awful. This is awful stuff. Ecosystemic goods and services. You know, it's the neoliberalization of this objectification of the exclusion of humans from nature. It's such a muddled, crazy thing. And then another one, safeguarding Australia, counteract the impact of invasive species through the applications of new technologies, integrating approaches across agencies and jurisdictions. Again, this policing of the species, these species that aren't wanted, that shouldn't be here. And I should say, while I'm there, that it's not done with any kind of consistency. I join with Siobhan in saying, you know, this inconsistency, you know, is really interesting with animals. So, for instance, at the moment, all the conservation biologists are frothing at the mouth at the moment because there's a group of small mammals that are in decline quite rapidly in northern Australia. They're frothing at the mouth, and they're renaming the cat as the main culprit, and getting really angry and getting into serious management mode for that, which is fair enough. But you know, an animal that really truly does do devastating ecosystemic damage is the brown trout. And you cannot say that stick caddis and small insignificant galaxias are less important to an ecosystem than, you know, very small populations of small mammals. You can't say that. And yet one becomes the driver of huge sums of money and big efforts, small furry animals, but dark, cold, unseen creatures at the bottom of a muddy, oozy stream or a lake, they can be gone. The environmentalists have done deals with government and other people over the trout, and because the trout is socially and politically sensitive. So we get an enrolment of culture and politics back into biomanagement. And we never get this consistency from it, because from the very word go, it was never a realistic concept. It was always contaminated. And when you speak to scientists in Australia, they will tell you, we cannot get rid of the cat. We know that. We cannot get rid of the cat. The cat is here to stay. Then I say to them, will it ever be naturalised? He said, for sure. Yeah, we won't be able to get rid of it. In generations' time, they will find it incomprehensible that we held these views. And I said, well, what about native animals? Won't they adapt to the cat? They said, yeah, they will, and they are adapting to the cat. In Hobart, for instance, there are very, very large populations of eastern barred bandicoot that are held to be extinct on the mainland because of the cat. But in Hobart, which is a real stronghold of cats, the eastern barred bandicoot has learnt to go into bushes and gardens that are impenetrable by cat. They go into blackberry and gorse thickets, and cats won't go in there. They found that out. I mean, and so they've adapted. Ecosystem. It's a strange thing, but it's created new forms of management of the natural world, and created a sense that there are creatures that belong and creatures that don't belong, and therefore created a human subjectivity to manage that. Another concept I quite like is landscape, which is also very widely used and has also driven subjectivities since it became identified in the 18th and 19th century, and as it's got developed with a kind of ecological, anthropological force behind it as well. And while ecosystem is given, static, cyclic, landscape is contested, historical, and better, if by an Anthropocene we mean history. If ecosystem references wider territorialization and governance, landscape references the detailed life worlds of experience, complexity, culture, evolution, knowledge, and change. And landscape is a perpetually changing physical manifestation of history. The ecosystem concept views the environment as always trying to return to a state of equilibrium. The landscape concept considers landscape transformation to be a process of evolution. And critically, ecosystems are zero-sum games, where the loss of some elements are understood as gains to others. This is why we talk about invasive species. That's the word, the invasive species. They're winning, ours are losing. Whereas the loss of some elements, whereas landscape can be a non-zero-sum game, where more complexity can be accommodated in win-win situations. And we actually know millions of examples of that in biology, where you can add more species to something that have been named as an ecosystem, and everything works out pretty well. It's not that this ecosystem is not a zero-sum game. And landscapes do not return to a state of equilibrium, but are palimpsests of successive disturbances over time. So ecosystems suggest legitimate community and belonging. Landscapes suggest open, fluid, volatile occupation. It speaks of sharing, accommodation, possibility of tolerance, succession, and change too. My second half of my paper is going to start now, where I move on. And I try to mobilise and use some of those conceptual changes in a case study. Recently I Googled the term feral cat, first with the addition of UK and then with the addition of Australia. Felis catus is a non-native species to both countries, but as an animal designated feral, they're treated in inexplicably different ways in the two locations. In the British case, their ferality is a cause for concern, prompting almost universal action for their welfare and care. In Australia, it's the opposite. It prompts action for their extermination and control. In Australia, the feral cat is largely disliked because of its assumed adverse impact on native species, though I do note it also stands in a very dark way for outsiders that come in and create trouble and mayhem for Australia. And I have before made the claim that they are a good metaphor for an Australia that likes to see itself as a closed society that is unfriendly and fearful of outsiders. And we cannot back away from the historic circumstances that lead to that conclusion, because they're still with us. A similar case might be made just as easily in Britain, that they are damaging to native species that are well loved. A similar case might just as easily be made in Britain, but it isn't. The total UK cat population is in excess of 10 million. About 1 million of those are feral. In Australia, it's the feral population is between 14 and 18 million, but actually the density of feral cats in Britain is about double that of Australia. The potential impact in Britain on native animals would seem more substantial in the potential impact on native animals in Britain would seem more substantial, but there is practically no scientific effort put into their eradication or control, nor public demand or support for it, despite very substantial public support for all native animal categories at risk. By contrast, in Australia, anti-cat sentiments are widespread and substantial, from the political leadership through to most levels of civil society, including art. Well, I don't know whether, does Kay Kessing count as art? I suppose she does. I see a few artists going, I don't know about that. The anti-cat sentiment can be found in more than just Kay Kessing. And Nick Smith provides really compelling evidence that supports the idea that feral cats are widely considered to be un-Australian. And it's not easy to know where the anti-cat sentiments came from. Was it from science, or was it from outside science that got into science? Because science is extremely responsive, for reasons I've already identified, to changes in perception in civil society. I'm just going to say something about cats in Britain, very briefly. Cats were introduced as probably a high-status animal by Iron Age royal lineage leaders who were doing deals. They were actually schooling themselves and their children in Rome way before the Romans invaded Britain. They probably picked up the cat, which the Romans brought in as a sacred animal from Egypt. This is a lovely cat mosaic. Look at the difference between Kessing and this. This is a society that quite liked the cat, but of course this is a society that didn't have a concept, ecosystem, with which to hate it with. And there we are, different subjectivities from different objects. But this is a very lovely, I think, representation of a cat. Mosaic floors were where treasured images were put in Roman society. You probably know that. It came into Britain with around 2,000 years ago, but there are still good reasons why it might not be tolerated. And one of them is, there's a whole load of stuff in this paper. Britain is bird crazy. A lot of bird species are at risk. Lots of them are at risk. A large population of feral cats could knock them out quite easily. This is always the most generous claim that people like Tim Flannery and Nick Lowe make now. At one time they were saying the cat has been a scapegoat for anthropogenic damage. Now they're saying, well, we've got to be careful with the cat because they could knock certain animals out. And I agree with that. But it's interesting that in Britain that case could be made quite easily, but it isn't. They also have an incredibly good biology of cat predation. They know that a lot of the native small mammals are predated. Large proportion of cats' diets are with this, but they have done the sums and seen what is sustainable within these populations, along with the birds. And the RSPB have actually issued a statement to say, you know, when you see cats taking birds, don't worry, we've done the sums. it's okay. They're knocking out the weak ones. There needs to be this going on. There is nowhere in Britain the series of published images published by science and government of feral cats with pretty native birds in their maws. They're almost invariably shown like that in Australia, whereas we know from stomach contents that they're mostly eating mice and rats. They do eat native birds too, but it's a way of manipulating new anti-cat subjectivities. It's not good science in the case of the feral cat. Not good science at all. Here's the list of the first few hits. I'll go down to about 50 hits on Google, and you can see this is in England. Most of them are concerned with the welfare of the animals. Lots and lots of charities set up, like Cat Action Trust. They get cats in, they neuter and release. They're looking after colonies and groups. They're doing a lot of work with them, and there's a lot of care. The RSPCA, the Animal Trust, Celia Hammond Animal Trust. There's no end of them. Messy Beasts is another one. Feral cat welfare is another one. There's a lot of concern for them. If you go to Australia and look at the same set, it's all how horrible they are, how much they're hated, and how much we've got to get rid of them, and the various ways in which we can be destroying them. And the imagery that comes out, if you just click on the image, is really quite drastic. I'm going to show that shortly. But the feral cat came into Australia, as you know, in fairly early on, and it made its way into the interior. It was introduced to the goldfields and rapidly spread once the rabbit and mice and rat plagues happened. And were it not for the cat, they would have been substantially worse. If you look at the ways in which the cat has been vilified by science, it's interesting because it's actually the case that in various places, key scientists have said we don't actually have any evidence that they've created any serious decline of any native species. I quote Chris Dickman here. He says, acceptable evidence for impact would be any demonstration that cats have caused a decline of 25% or more in the population abundance or geographical distribution of any native species. Unfortunately, and I wonder why he says unfortunately, unambiguous evidence of this kind does not exist. And other people have said that as well. On the cat, the threat abatement plan, which is actually saying on the same thing, ideally we would eradicate the cat completely from Australia. It says that there's no evidence of feral cats causing extinctions on mainland Australia or Tasmania. And yet that is the stated reason given for such a draconian thing. And it also says control of feral cats at a continental scale is not feasible. You can't, it's not going to do it. You've got to knock out more than 98% of the cats. In order to do it, you can't do it. So but they keep putting in big claims for money, and they keep getting it from government because it's in the research guidelines as a priority. So you know, it reads like crazy stuff. I have been talking to scientists. I've been laying hard claims about it. I've been giving them a really hard time. They know that. I've been talking about species cleansing. I've been really rubbing them up the wrong way for a long time. And now we talk. I know who all the really serious ones are, and they are now saying that you know, they say things like it's incredibly difficult to prove anything in biology. Well, why do you hold such extreme views then? Why do you base such draconian actions on it? They suspect the cat, and I am totally with them when they say that the cat can take can create declines and may create extinction. The main examples I've been given recently, though, are these. And what happens is up in northern Australia, they've been using 1080 to knock out dingoes and 1080 to knock out foxes. And when you do that, the cat population goes through the roof. And then the small mammals get hit. But they're blaming the cat. They're blaming the cat. The cat's going down for the crime, but they're not causing it at all. They were perfectly under control. They are actually quite easy. You can control them with foxes, their numbers. You can control them with dingoes. Dingoes are really good. But people were really good as well. I've got a senior scientist who told me that before Aboriginal people were put into missions, taken off their territories and put into missions, they used to hunt the cat so effectively in northern Australia that these animals were abundant. And the great thing about hunting and hunter-gatherers is they move on. When game's abundant, they stay. When it gets short, they move to an area where it's abundant. They're very good at keeping the numbers down. This is why it's so important to have a notion of human beings in the landscape. Because in any case, the scientists are in the landscape anyway. We can't pretend we're not there. They're not there doing things. They're not exempt from ecosystem. So we could almost call it the scientisticene, because they're the ones doing most of it. A lot of ordinary Australians are blissfully unaware or aware, as in the case of the Brumby and many other animals, that they were important Australians too. They're actually part of our history. The reason people didn't like Brumbies and Brumbies mares being machine gunned out of helicopters is because they felt that they had adapted. They were Australian. The animals, when they're here for a while and they've been part of this national project in the way the Brumby was, that they are enrolled, they're naturalised, like the Mustang was in North America. The scientists are coming round to that. There's a big section in the paper about, there's some really interesting stuff about who's going frothy at the mouth about feral animals. This is basically the Anglophone world is the only one that will be using feral cat. So because it's a word search. So, but you can see Australia is burning, dark blue compared. England is just as like a faint little blue colour, and America has got the bug a bit, but Canada's not so bothered. And you can and here's Britain's. This is straight off Google. I haven't selected this. This is the Google thing when you press the image from the Google search, feral cats UK. And you can see little kittens, cute little cats, cats sort of looking lost on their own, blah. This is the, hold on, there's the Australian one. How many cats there with pretty birds? This is a major something cockatoo, that one up there. Very loved animal, and all the birds, and then there's cats and hunters. Here's a scientist doing something despicable to a cat down there, and there's a whole range of people who Nick Smith has picked up with really seriously anti-cat sentiments. Richard Evans, who said we should destroy all of them, replace them with Australian companion animals, should all be Australian. Trish Worth, who compared the way we said we should treat refugees and migrants in the same way, with much more draconian, like we do cats, she said. Janet Holmes-a-Court in the constitutional debates was talking about, the assertion of Australian values, and she mentioned hating cats as an Australian value. Honestly, I've got check it out. This is why Harriet Ripvo, who's someone we all like, right, says introduced aliens were often as appreciated or deplored in the same terms that were applied to human migrants. And I then go on in the paper, I haven't got time for it now, to show actually how without the concept of ecosystem and natural environment, Britain actually filled up with a lot of feral animals through its history. The cat was just one of them. The Twickenham parakeet, as it's called, which I think is actually the Indian ring-necked parakeet. It's been adopted. Why? They love it there, and it's really terrible. It does terrible things to trees and fruit. The grey squirrel is almost singly responsible for killing most of southern England's beech forest, but they love it, and it's protected. And I've got quotes from the Forestry Commission, who are the one group who should really be hammering them for the damage they do, and they don't. They say it's really important. It's a loved animal, and it's to be well regarded and looked after. There's the irony is we've got the ring-necked wallaby all over Derbyshire. People travel for miles to get it, and the latest thing is people have them to mow their lawns. In Britain, there's the muntjac deer. There's no end of it. But the thing is, without that concept, that concept for people to hate outside nature, what happened is they came in and they quite liked it. And it's also interesting. Britain as an imperial nation. Ripvo says that it's all very well for Britain to do this because these were displayed as trophies. Bringing in these things, and the love of the exotica was part and parcel of that age of exploration, but also the age of colonialisation. That's not true for Australia, although Australia did get stuck into this terribly French post-Republic idea of acclimatisation. There's no way New Zealand and Australia can escape the charges. They got into acclimatisation and introduced a lot of these animals, but it did happen to coincide and hit the new concept, which created the turbulence that creates the rather strangely politically, socially, culturally infected science of wild animal management in this country. I'm just going to take a liberty and conclude. Tellingly, I say, most Aboriginal groups studied the same antipathy to introduced animals is lacking. And this is, when I read Bruce Rose, I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe this because I believed that they would surely hate introduced species more than anyone, more than scientists. These animals that were brought in by the invading whites who did all these despicable things to them. But actually, that's not what happened, because they too didn't have that concept. They didn't have the concept of ecosystem, and they also didn't have the concept of nation. And had they had the concept of nation, they would have known that they were left out of this one. They weren't part of nation. They didn't have national estate to be included in, and therefore they couldn't share in this idea of keeping non-belonging. The irony is breathtaking. It really is. But I can't do justice to it. But the fact is that Aboriginal people made sense to them because they were operating with a landscape notion. And a lot of these introduced animals, the cat included, turned up. A lot of Aboriginal people claimed that it was there before white people. And for a lot of them, they probably saw the cat before they saw white people. That could remain true. But it's a perfectly logical concept of native animals, and thus feral animals, which is called into being in the same breath, was meaningless to them. Far more meaningful to them was the concept of country, a nutritious land they occupied and looked after. Cats were nutritious, and when Aboriginal people hunted them, cat numbers did not get out of control. Therefore, they never saw the bad effects in their country that the scientists anticipated but didn't have the money to properly research. So in conclusion, the vivid differences between the UK and Australia will, I predict, resolve. Australia seems set to become less wedded to ecosystem and more to landscape, like the Aborigines and the British, with whom Australia has yet to reconcile themselves to. As a British person, I don't feel that Australia has reconciled itself to its differences with Britain. It's not as serious, it doesn't bother me that much, but it bothers me a little bit. But it bothers me far more that, that they're unable to reconcile themselves to Aboriginal people and the concept of landscape. I think it will do this as it ages and the sharp edges of its arrival will be worn away, and as the impacts of its birth become less disturbing. Already the scientists I've spoken to know that animals like the cat are here to stay and will become naturalised in time. They also know that the native animals will adapt to them, as animals always do, though of course they worry that some may not be given the time in which to do it. And this is where they now see their role in identifying where complex, non-ecosystemic aberrations disturb further the disturbed landscape and leave some small creatures exposed. And I'm sure we all thank them for that, because that would be unpleasant to see them go. Anything, though, from bizarre racial policies that remove Aboriginal hunters whose habitus involved the cats, to farmers pursuing tight supermarket-driven margins with 1080, or to the arbitrary carnage of random natural genetic mutations in the mouths of Tasmanian devils. All of these things are these non-ecosystemic aberrations which we're having to deal with. This is the reality of landscape. This is landscape talking. Australia will become Tim Lowe's new nature, I have no doubt, and its greater tolerance will reflect back on its ability to live better with other humans too. Like Donna Haraway, Australia is searching for a concept of agency that opens up possibilities for figuring relationality in social worlds where actors fit oddly at best into previous taxa of the human, the natural or the constructed. There couldn't be a better quote for what I'm trying to say this morning. Some say that the Anthropocene will be succeeded by the Sustainocene. I certainly hope not, as I said, and I think we must stay the Anthropocene and live with it, simply do it better and to be more responsible as anthros, if for no other reason than to avoid the danger of a total crap name for our next geological period. Thank you very much.
I was admit I was a couple of minutes late in, so I missed your background. What was your background, sorry?
Sorry?
Oh, I was a couple of minutes late. What was your background? So I missed that before I start to frame my...
Anthropology, sociology.
Okay. I've got quite a few questions and comments about both sections. Would you like me to start on cats? Just one question. Okay. Okay.
Professor, thank you for a very enjoyable talk. I think that perhaps your basic premise, the species history, the Anthropocene species history, may be an oxymoron. I think we should be talking about a species prehistory, which is 10 years longer. And I would argue that if we can do that, then the cat, we could not have evolved the way we have without the cat.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, agree.
I'll kind of just amalgamate them rather than focusing on specifics then. So The main comment and also question I wanted to have is you're comparing the Australia, the UK, and to some degree the USA, and a lot of the things you're saying cats, but you're really comparing apples, oranges, and pears. So cats in Australia are a very, very recent thing, whereas cats have been in the USA not for so long, and the UK for quite a long time. So in the USA there is a native species, or there are native species of cats. So the fauna in the USA has had to adapt to a fairly similar species, and therefore they're more adaptable because they're only introducing a predator that's already quite similar to predators that they already have natively existing, whereas in Australia that's not the case at all. We have a couple of small carnivorous mammals, but we don't have anything in our ecosystem that is quite like the cat, and that naivety to that kind of predator in addition to mammals. So most of our things here are marsupials. Australia and New Zealand are very similar, that our landscape is dominated by birds. Birds for reasons.
Okay. Yep.
So
Cut to the
question
chase.
is, where did you get a lot of the things that you said about the impact of cats? There's a lot of good evidence.
Sources.
I've got a million questions to ask about sources for some of these
I actually gave you two. There's loads and loads and loads. Dickman was given the job of summarising all the scientific evidence in respect of the feral cat, and I quoted, that quote was from his summing up, and the other quote I gave, two quotes I gave you, was from the Australian government threat abatement plan for the feral cat. Okay, that is also a summary of evidence. I have also spoken to the most senior invasive species scientists, and I've asked them to give me, the definitive papers and research that show it. I preface what I say by saying I'd already allowed that islands and certain other areas there had been declines and extinctions. I had that. I'm not talking about New Zealand. I had never once mentioned New Zealand. Okay. And they came up with some, but in every single case you see, they were muddied by the fact that a lot of the impact that had caused decline or extinctions had actually been distributed and was largely the result of human interventions. There's lots and lots of...
Let's move on.
Yeah.
We've got two more.
Show me, send them to me.
Tom and then Tess, and I think that's probably going to be it. So, Tom, over.
Okay. Just a quick question about the distinction you're drawing between ecosystem and landscape, which is very interesting. I guess it seemed to me like the way you were understanding ecosystem is not how most biologists would today want to use the term, and that the kind of static, unfixed ecosystem, the idea of a climax community that has some sort of a natural order, is not today the way that the term is used. So I wondered if the contrast still holds within a more contemporary scientific framework for thinking through ecosystem. And then I also wondered how that relates to the contrast you wanted to make between Australia and the UK, where the UK has certainly been, all of its policy, deeply influenced by this ecosystem thinking. I mean, the term itself was coined by a British ecologist, biologist. So, I mean, that long history of ecosystem thinking is thoroughly entrenched in both places, so I can't see how connecting it to Australia makes the kind of claim you want to make.
Yeah. Actually, the way the ecosystem term is operationalised in policy and practice, in fact, does identify species that belong to particular places. Scientists, I can show you 500 pages where scientists say that. Okay, and I can also say where they say how they define native feral animals that have strayed out of their ecosystem and therefore need to be culled. And I can also show you how much evidence has been shown to say they can't operationalise that because there is no way the Australian public will go along with native animals being culled very, very openly, apart from a few species. So you know, you'll see it in the paper. It's much more expanded and nuanced. But the correspondence between native animals and citizenship, which hold regardless of where you happen to be, is one of the sliding metaphors that I talked about at the beginning. In England, yeah, I know it was an Englishman that coined the expression, but they don't operationalise it. Sorry, in their management they don't operationalise it because they actually include large numbers of almost every animal that I know of that has been introduced or got in gets managed as part of the national estate. And in fact, the national estate is interesting in the sense that it doesn't really exist in the same way that it does in Australia. It's a much more fluid concept, landscape-driven sensibility, I would argue. And I think that is held to by, again, civil society. I think civil society believe in that. And that also impacts on how science is done in Britain.
Thank you. I really wanted to thank you as an anthropologist, one to another, sort of, particularly for reminding us that Australian history, in fact, exceeds just when Captain Cook arrived. And I mean by that, if you stretch it back, the contact history goes back further than Captain Cook, of course. And so the history of the cat easily goes back to the 15th or 16th century, easily. On this continent, just if you think about the trade with Asia from the north. So if we flip history upside down, which would be a good idea, you can see that we've got a much longer and much more complex intercultural history, which would also be an interspecies history. Yeah. And also I love that you recognise that Indigenous people have got this incredibly flexible idea about what makes for a good animal and and which makes also difficulties for a whole lot of as you say, the scientists who are running around trying to cull water buffalo, donkey, camel, various kinds of plants, and hope to, in this notion of partnership, enrol Aboriginal people to kind of make it all kosher. But in fact, they're very reluctant participants in a lot of that. Yeah. And I'll just leave you with this figure, which is the Jesus donkey. Donkeys which are, you know, you just cannot go near because, and they'll use Christianity as the reason, but actually it's also because they're damn good eating. So, you know, and the Jesus donkey, just by the way, it's got a cross on its back just in terms of its fur marking, and so Aboriginal people will tell you that this is actually a sacred animal now, so you can't touch it. And so they're invoking a whole lot of, and quite deliberately too, the jokes about this behind the scenes are just hilarious. So my comment to you is really not so much of a question, but an expression of gratitude.
Oh, thank you very much. I've got two responses to that. The first is I am under the misconception. I too, like you, believe that the cat went back pre. There was evidence that it was pre Captain Cook, but I thought there was some kind of genetic experiment that was done that showed that they're all from Britain, and therefore, mind you, that doesn't mean to say that they couldn't have been from Britain and come via Asia anyway. So I'd like you to tell me more about that. But the other thing is the wonderful irony. When I first came across Bruce Rose's study of Aboriginal attitudes to introduced species in Central Australia on the Central Australia Land Council website, it was posted there and was one of the most wonderful reads I've ever had, because he actually admitted giving them leading questions. He said, I was so frustrated by I was guilty of, saying things like, surely you must, things like that, all the things you mustn't do. But he was honest enough to say that in this essay, and I really respected him for that. But then the thing that really made me laugh was after I clicked off reading the Bruce Rose paper, I went back to the Central Land Council site, and it had a kind of series of responses, and it led its policy aims. And as a result of Bruce Rose's research, it concluded that one of its key priority areas is environmental education for Aborigines. that they don't have the proper attitudes. So I just thought it was priceless. Yeah.
Okay, can we thank Adrian for his